Chi Shati Adi Tekatihan Hatu Yake which in Hasati Cajun Yagi Ya Yagi Era Kayani Disi Dachadu Shuya Chia Dis. Thank you for coming here, everybody. It's good to see you. We feel good to be together again. It's Friday, April 7th, and we have a guest speaker today. Zeus James Crippen is with us. He was a personal mentor to me 2 summers ago during my time as a Lingit language scholar. He taught me how to gloss sentences. He's a master of grammar in Lingit. And for his Lingit introduction, I'll introduce him. Lingit Enach Zeus Yudu Asal. Late Kach Enach James Crippen Yudu Asal. Deshi Tan Nach City. Kakak Hetach Tiknach Adi Yadi Yawa. Stekhin Kwan Waha. So Zeus is his name in Lingit. In English, people call him James Crippen. He is Deshi Tan, Kakakit, Ziknach Adi, a child of the Ziknach Adi, and Dechim Kwan. So, without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Zeus. Yi'it Kuaha. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, so let me get this going.
Okay.
And I should be able to share like this. All right. Oops. Halfway started. Okay. That working? Okay. Yeah. Hey. So, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Tlingit language variation. I was asked to do a little bit about dialects. So I'll give you some background information on how we study differences in dialects in linguistics, and then I'll talk specifically about Tlingit language variation. And I'll show us some facts about the major dialects in Tlingit, and then a little bit in detail about the different varieties of Northern Tlingit that you are undoubtedly all very familiar with at this point. So, James Crippen Hinginan is an old-fashioned term for English, by the way, England. McGill Shkuntain, professor of linguistics at City. McGill University is in Montreal in Canada. So this is lots of my family. Child of the Signachati among the Stikine people from Wrangell, which is Kachkanak. And you can see Stikine is the Tlingit term for Stikine River. So we'll talk a little bit about language variation first. When we study language, there are two basic viewpoints we can take on how language works. We can study language at a particular point in time, which is called synchronic, and we can study language over a long period of time, and that's called diachronic. These are just ancient Greek terms. The field of linguistics, the way it started was studying languages diachronically. How did languages evolve? Because there was a recognition that Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit seemed to be related. And then it led to describing the hypothesized, the theoretical parent language that we don't have records of, that they descended from. During the 20th century, the emphasis mostly shifted from this diachronic, language through history to a synchronic approach, studying how people are speaking right now at a particular place and time, and how human language works generally. So linguistics itself is the science of human language. What is it in our brains that makes us speak, and how does language work? So the study of groups of people, when we're not just looking at one person, we look at several, in New York City or something. This led people to notice that there's phenomena in language that are associated with social groups. And this developed into a field we call sociolinguistics. It's linguistics social. The interest that people have is, how does a language vary between its different speakers? And so we talk about variation. Variation is fundamentally, it's differences in speech in a particular language. Given any language, people speak different. We usually look at the variation between individuals. So, this person versus this person, how do they speak? But we can also consider how a single speaker speaks, right? Because we know that we talk different in different situations. I speak at home differently than I would, say, in court. And those differences can be studied. We can analyze how people use the same language in different contexts. A key take-home message that comes out of this field of research is that all human languages vary. No two speakers of any language around the world speak exactly the same way. Even in a single family, we know for a fact that siblings, twins, speak languages differently. So there is no ideal copy of a language. Each person has their own. Okay, so looking at this in social groups, how do we track them? So we keep track of the social groups by what we call social variables. And this is just any kind of random phenomenon that you can distinguish different people. I mean, it can be names, but we usually study sort of variables, and we're looking at large groups of people over different, properties, like how old they are, what generation they belong to, their gender identity, sexual preference, social standing, how wealthy they are, social class, their family, who do they descend from, who have they married, what kind of kids do they have, their ethnicity, religion, and so forth. There's lots and lots and lots of this. And it's just a way of tracking, like, how do speakers of languages differ based upon the social groups that they are in. And one of the major significant ones is geography. And it really matters a lot, apparently, where people are born, where they live, and how they've traveled over their lives. Particularly the last one, because our speech actually changes. The way we speak language changes depending upon the community we're living with. So if you move from one town to another, that actually does change your speech over time. It's quite subtle, but it does happen. So, okay, languages vary. And if we take a group of people who speak similarly, then we can call that a language variety. It's just a neutral term saying there's some sort of thing that they have in common. The way they speak language is in common. This variation may not be perceived by speakers. People may not be conscious of the fact that their language differs from some other group. That's actually very common. And so then we have this specific term of dialect. This comes, the ancient Greek term here is simply through speech. And that's because back in ancient Greece, they simply identified each other by the way they speak. I can tell a person through their speech. This person's from Sparta, this person's from Athens, or whatever. Dialect assumes some sort of variable, but it's not actually telling you what. We typically guess that it means geography, but that's not necessarily the case. And a famous example is what's known as African American vernacular English. It's the typical English spoken by Black people in the United States. And that's a dialect, but it's not associated with geography, because you can find the same kind of speech used in Seattle or Atlanta, right? So it is a dialect, but it's associated with ethnicity rather than geography. So we have to be careful about what people talk about when they say dialect. But a key thing we say for any dialect is that speakers must be able to understand other speakers. So this is what's called the mutual intelligibility criterion. Are people intelligible to each other? If two varieties of a language, we recognize they're different. If they are unintelligible to each other, or if they are intelligible to each other, then they're the same language. Different varieties, but the same language because speakers understand each other. If there's a whole bunch of people who speak a particular variety, that's some sort of dialect, right? And crucially, dialects have to be mutually intelligible. Separate languages aren't mutually intelligible. This matters a lot in indigenous languages in North America because many of them are spread over very large geographic regions. And we have many cases where there are speakers of dialect A and dialect B right next to each other. They understand each other. And dialect B understands the next door neighbors who speak dialect C, but A doesn't understand C. So there can be a question of where we draw these, language versus dialect lines, and it's different for each situation. One other fact that we know is every language has at least one dialect. If it only has one, we just sort of ignore that. But every language shows dialect variation. And from a linguistic point of view, we consider all dialects to be equal. That's because linguists say all languages are equal. We say that they're all equally valuable, they're all equally expressive. There's no fundamental reasons that one language should be better or worse than any other. And if that's true for languages, then that's also true for dialects. There are social customs that favor different ones. Oh, they sound like a hick, so that's clearly low class or something like that. But those are social attitudes, and they have nothing to do with the language itself. That's a really important distinction for us to make. One other thing is that dialects can they go all the way down. You can get all the way down. You take a dialect and then divide it in two, and so this group, and then divide that down, and then one of these groups, and divide that. You can keep slicing it up over and over and over and all the way down. So exactly where you draw the lines depends upon what you're talking about. And as a consequence, people disagree about this stuff all the time. So as I noted, the term dialect doesn't specify any particular social variables. There are other ones, these other kinds of lect that people will use to be very specific. So usually dialect is some sort of geographic group, but it doesn't have to be. Idiolect is an interesting one because it refers to the variety of a language spoken by a specific person. Every human being has an idiolect for every language they speak. So I have an idiolect of English. It's unique to me. Nobody else speaks my English. That's really important in the Tlingit context because we don't have a lot of speakers. So we have a lot of idiolects and a sense that there used to be much larger communities surrounding these idiolects, but each speaker is a sample of what might have been a larger community, right? So a lot of our information about Tlingit is actually idiolectal information, and there's a question of whether that really reflects a whole dialect, or is this a particular thing that one speaker does in a certain way. There's also familect, which is a variety spoken by a family, not usually considered in English, but it's actually very important in the Tlingit context because, once again, we're talking about not very big groups of people. So there is, for example, a Marx family dialect, or a familect, right? That Kepne, Nora Dauenhauer, and her siblings and parents all sort of have together, right? And it's characteristic. There's certain characteristics in their group of speech that set them apart from other people they even grew up with. Regiolect, variety spoken in a region. This depends on, of course, how you define the region, but it also really depends on the idea that people stay put. So that may not be so useful for us. It's useful in a case like in Europe or China, where many generations of people live in the same place and never go anywhere. But in Tlingit culture, we know we are very highly mobile. People are constantly traveling. So the idea of regions is not as useful for us. And then there's finally sociolect. This is just any sort of social group, whatever you want to choose, aristocrats or a gender or something like that. So there's a lot out there for dialect. But one last point I want to make about this term is that this way that we use it for linguistics is not the same as how people often use it in other contexts. Often what people really mean by a dialect is any kind of variety I consider to be inferior. And so we see this thing where people say, oh, the language is spoken in the city, the dialect is rural. The language is what people speak in school. The dialect is what they speak out on the street. The language is what the government uses. The dialect is whatever else, right? In some of these cases, dialect is actually not even the same language. There's a complete ignorance of the real facts about the language. This is very common in Europe. So because of this habit of people saying, well, dialect is any variety I don't like, people use that for indigenous languages. And we have to push back on this because indigenous languages are typically rural. They're typically not standard. They're typically not official. And so people are perceiving them as being inferior. And they say things like the Tlingit dialect, and that's implying that Tlingit isn't a real language, right? So that's something we want to push back on. Indigenous languages are real languages. Every language has dialects. All dialects are fundamentally equal. You'll hear that out there when people say, well, that's dialect. That's not the term. That's not how we would use that term in linguistics, where we consider, well, it's just, differences between different people. Okay, so with all that, how about actual Tlingit? So let's talk a little bit about Tlingit language variation. The study of language variation in Tlingit is still in its absolute infancy. Most information about how our language varies is just scattered all over the place, and there's no systematic study of it. The documentation we have emphasizes that there are sound differences and that there are, different words being used by people, and that's about it. There's very, very little information about how the larger structure, how do sentences vary? How do the verbs vary? How do people get different kinds of meaning across in different communities? Almost nothing about this. And we expect that this should be different from community to community, but there's just no research on it. And in a lot of cases, there's just no research on the variation in a community. Nobody's ever studied it at all. Sometimes, of course, we're down to nothing but recordings because there's no living speakers to ask questions of anymore. And then we also know that languages changes over time. All languages constantly change. And we know that that's true for Tlingit. We have records going back to the very early Russian contact period, but nobody's actually studied how the language changes over time. So for example, how has language changed in Sitka since the Russians arrived? We can't say because nobody's really studied any of this. And it's another way that variation needs to be researched. So that we're just we don't have a lot of information about how Tlingit works in these contexts. But we can say for sure, there's a very strong correlation between certain features in Tlingit and the geography of where we live. And it leads us to divide the language into three basic groups. There's a northern Tlingit, which is the vast majority. That's basically everything from Wrangell north to Yakutat and all the communities in the inland in Yukon and British Columbia. And then there's Southern Tlingit, which is two groups around Ketchikan and Saxman, and then around Klawock and Craig. And then finally, the last one, which is Tongass Tlingit, which we know from speakers in Ketchikan. So there are three groups then by geography, and there are distinct differences between these varieties. So we saw Northern Tlingit or Naki Tlingit, Southern Tlingit or Ishki Tlingit, and Tongass Tlingit, Tan Tlingit. The variation between these three groups seems to be the most significant differences. When we look at how language varies in Tlingit communities, this split seems to be the biggest type of variation, the most obvious and significant. They correlate with these parts of Tlingit Ani, right? So we can say that effectively these are dialects. They are variations on the language that are connected to particular geographic areas. So this is a reasonable use of the term dialect. Okay, so what are these? I've just said, oh, there's geography, but I haven't told you how they're actually different. The most significant difference is tone. As you know, the variety of Tlingit you learn, which is Northern, the Northern Tlingit dialect has high and low tone. There are some vowels that have to be high pitched and some vowels that have to be low pitched, right? So we have differences like sha, awe, it's a woman. Sha awe, it's a mountain. Right? Southern Tlingit has that same high and low, but it also has a falling that happens on long vowels. And then in Tongass Tlingit, there isn't any tone. Instead, they have these things using the larynx. There's differences in the way that the larynx works on long vowels. So this is the major difference between the three dialects, is how they deploy tone or not. And then there are some other differences that are closely related to these, that we see the same variation in language tracking these geographic groups. One of them is that there's a certain pattern of vowel dropping that's in Tongass and Southern, and also some neighboring Northern communities, where certain vowels disappear where we would expect them in other types of Tlingit. Another one is a distinct sort of group of vocabulary that's only used in Tongass and Southern Tlingit, as well as a whole bunch of borrowings from Chinook jargon, which was a trade language that's no longer in use, but seems to have been used much more in the South than in the North. Another example is there's some limited spreading of rounding. So that's w, the lip rounding, spreads from the consonant onto the following vowel in a lot of Northern varieties, but not as much in the South. So we have a difference between gwit and gut for a dime, right? 10 cents. In my variety, it's gwit, but Shah Keek will say gut, for example. There's probably a bunch of other differences, but we need a lot more study to nail these things down.
That's good.
So Tongass Tlingit is spoken in the very far south of Singit Anyi. Portland Canal area, north to Metlakatla and Ketchikan, and this is Kwan. And this variety of the language, this dialect doesn't have tone. It has these laryngalized vowels. We call them short ah, a long ah, a glottalized ah, and then a fading ah. So I'll give you some examples here. Contrast how this works in Tongass and Northern. So in example number 1, this is a Northern phrase. Sha awe, it's a woman. Sha awa. The same sentence in Tongass Tlingit is going to be sha awa, sha awa. So here we have Northern has this ah vowel, and Tongass just has ah and nothing special. Then in number 2, on the right, we have mountain. And this is what's called a minimal pair. These two words vary in only one thing in Northern Tlingit, and that's the tone. So in number 2a, we have sha awa, and you can tell by the awa that the preceding sha is low, right? Sha awa. In Tongass Tlingit in 2b, this is sha awa, sha awa. There's no tone. It's got this, right? This vowel sort of fades out. And then the third difference, so we look at in number 3, in A, we've got another Northern Tlingit example. Ha awa, it's a man. In Tongass Tlingit, this is ha awa, ha awa. So there's a glottal catch, like a glottal stop right at the end of the vowel, which doesn't normally happen in other varieties. So then we see that Tongass has 3 kinds of vowel. It's got this plain vowel in blue, it's got a glottalized vowel in green, and a fading vowel in purple. And that's contrasting to the 2 kinds of tone that Northern Tlingit has, which is high and low. Right? So the little table here shows us the patterns we just looked at. So Tongass has a 3-way distinction where Northern only has a 2-way distinction. Oh, I forgot to check this. I hope this works. And I want to make this play. I don't know if you'll hear this. You're not?
No, I don't hear that one.
Okay, I may have to stop share and turn the thing on. Hold on. I forgot to check the box for sharing sound. All right. Now that's may work. Okay, hopefully. Now we'll try. So, let's rewind. Oops. Now it's going out the wrong thing here. And
Cat Island you to lit hak ayu ye konatichin tag itik you atcha esi nachtni chat ayatus huknut we tag iti atchari how dark as you are dark at nacht.
so what we heard there is this is Kashnak Emma Williams. This is a little short sample that I transcribed for us. And you can hear there's not the typical da 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 that we are accustomed to hearing from Lingit spoken from Northerners. The patterns are different. Okay.
I could hear too that she said
You can hear that that glottal catch as part of her speech. Yeah. Why is this? Okay, hold on. We've got technical issues. So there, okay, maybe this will work now. All right. So then I'll talk about Southern Tlingit. So Southern Tlingit, Ishki Tlingit, this is spoken in the southern areas next door to Tantaquan. One is Sanya Kwan, and that's around the Beam Canal area near Ketchikan. And then the other one is Hanya Kwan, and that's the western side of Prince of Wales. And this variety has tone, but it has a different tone system than the northern Tlingit. So we'll look at this just for a moment. We'll see in number 4, we've got the same form in both varieties. So both northern and southern sound the same. Sha'awe, it's a woman. And then in 5, again, the same thing. Sha'awe, sound the same. So this is the same pattern in both dialects. There's just a low or a high tone and a low tone. But it gets more complicated. In 6, we have an example in Northern Tlingit. Ha'awe, it's a man. In Southern Tlingit, this has falling tone. And so they say, ha'awe, ha'awe. And that falling tone doesn't exist in the Northern Tlingit dialect. This falling tone also, although it happens unpredictably in some words like this, it also happens predictably if there's any voiced sounds that come after it. So ya or wa or na, and any of those 3 sounds, then a high tone will always be a falling tone. So it's partly predictable. And here we have tai awe, it's a garden in Northern Tlingit. And then in Southern Tlingit, we say tai awe, tai awe. So there's this falling tone again. So this is a different pattern between the 2 dialects. So they do have similar tone systems, but there are some differences. Here's an example of a speaker. This is Gashek Shenrideni of the Nechati Sanya Kwan.
Ya tape koch a take ya machine a church a food kakoslanik. Chuan Kone kau ditnik ya hashagun ya Sanya Kwan. Ya qi qakai yihasuti. Yuga pa chutesla khiwa.
So you can hear in a couple of spots, especially when he goes on, like you can hear that real obvious falling pitch. And then Bone kaudut nik yaha shagun yasanya kwan. Right? Is it very distinct where if we were speaking a northern variety like mine, it would be Bone kaudut nik yaha shagun yasanya kwan, and it wouldn't have that falling pitch going. So there is a difference here. It's quite subtle. And if you've learned Northern Tlingit, it's going to be really hard to catch this because your brain has already started to erase these falling pitches. So learning the Southern varieties takes a bunch of work. And unfortunately for us, there's just not a lot of documentation of it either.
Yeah, tape which a
Oh.
take a machine, a judge, a food kakotlanik. Juan, Koneko, the Knik Yaha, Shagun, Yasan Yakwan. Ya Gi, Kakai Yahasuti. Yuga, Chutesa Kiua.
Repeated it, sorry. So if we put these all together, we get the pattern shown in this little table. We see that on the top, we've got Northern Tlingit, and it's red and blue, or red and, whatever that, Nechin color is in English. So high, low. In Southern, we've got high, high, low, the falling high, low, and then low. Right? And then in Tongass, we don't have the tone at all in those first two. And in the final two, we've got different things going on with that glottal closure at the end, and then the sort of glottal wide opening at the end, shah. Right? So each of these dialects has its own system organizing what's going on with these vowels, and they're not the same as the others. Correspondences between them are fairly regular. So you can basically use this chart to predict in most cases what the different dialects are going to do, but they're not the same. All three of these are mutually intelligible. So speakers from Yakutat have no trouble listening to the recording of a Tonga speaker and understanding what they're saying. Every now and then there's bits and pieces that I don't recognize that word, or, oh, they spoke a little bit different. But in general, they understand each other. So this tells us these are all Lingit Yucatanki. They're just different dialects of the language, and they're fundamentally organized differently, but they're all equal in that they are all Lingit, right? So they are Lingit Yucatanki, Lingit Yucatanki, and Lingit Yucatanki, right? They're all the same language. So the last part that I wanted to talk about is Northern Tlingit. We've established that that's one of the dialects, but there's a lot to it. You probably have already recognized this, that there's a lot of stuff going on in Northern Tlingit varieties. We can take the Northern Tlingit, which is anything from Wrangell to Yakutat and Teslin, like anything in that triangle is Northern Tlingit. But we can further subdivide it into smaller groups. And these, it's not a coincidence, they line up with certain clan because that's the way the people are organizing, ourselves. So the southernmost one is the transitional Northern Tlingit, and that's spoken in Shtakin Kwan, so that's my variety, and Ki Kwan in Cake. And then there's inland Northern Tlingit, and that's from Aten Kwan, Deslin Kwan, and Tagish Kwan. There's Gulf Coast Northern Tlingit, which is Qonachu Kwan, Shachayik Kwan, and Qashyach Kwan. And then there's the Central Coast Northern Tlingit, which is all the other communities, such as Juneau and Sitka and so forth. Now, you can divide each of these even further. As I mentioned, the dialects go all the way down to the individual speakers. You can divide these at the very least into community groups. But even there, some of it doesn't work. We find that some communities actually have more than one. So for example, in Teslin, there's evidence that there's actually two separate varieties, probably because people from two communities settled in together with each other. And that's still persisting over a century later. So transitional Northern Tlingit is spoken in Shtakin Kwan and Cake Kwan. So Pachkanag, Wrangell, Gantiak Site, Petersburg, and Cake. It was previously also spoken in Saudan, and which is Sumdum, and Kuyu Island. And we know this by reports of people from places like Wrangell and Cake who say, yes, they, when they moved into our communities and they brought the same speech with them. Transitional Northern Tlingit has some Southern-like features that aren't around in the other Northern Tlingit dialects. It's still really a Northern Tlingit. It has the same tone system, but it's got little hints of Southernness, a slight Southern drawl to it, if you'll allow me to compare it to English. So these are some of the features. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but one that particularly sticks out to a lot of people is the fact that certain E vowels disappear. So for the back of my hand, I say achchkush, achchkush, whereas most Northern speakers would say achjekush, achjekush, and have two syllables, right? Achchkush, so that it's different. There's little bits and pieces that are dropped. Another one is, I mentioned before, gwit instead of gut. There's the w sound spreads into the vowel in most Northern Tlingit, so you get gut. If you just hold on to that lip rounding, you get gu instead of wi, right? And in the Southern varieties, and then also in transitional, that's spreading hasn't gone all the way through. My variety of Tlingit is mostly undocumented. There's very, very little written about it, but we have some recordings of different speakers, and there's still a few speakers in Cake. So we're trying to, put together what we know about it. So here's a quick example of this variety of Tlingit from Hina Pag Forrest DeWitt. He was actually born in Juneau, but he spent most of his adult life in Cake and Wrangell. And his daughter, I learned a lot from his daughter, Cladena Margaret Rose Hope. And she said that when they were kids, they used to mercilessly make fun of him for speaking with a Juneau accent. And so he would always strive really hard to speak Wrangell. And anytime he didn't, everybody would make fun of him. So, this is, here he's talking directly to his children in this recording. So it's very Wrangell. It's got a very Wrangell flavor to it. For recordings as good as we can get, sadly. This, a lot of these older tapes are in rough shape. The one that really sticks out to a lot of people, and something that I learned early on, is right in that first sentence. Atu satu tua sku. So those little circles mean that vowel has been deleted. And this is typical in the Southern Tlingit dialect and in the Tongass Tlingit dialect. And it also happens a lot in Wrangell and to a certain extent in Cake. So we say achtwasku instead of achtuwasiku. And because of that, a lot of other Northern speakers say that we sound like we talk too fast because we're dropping certain syllables. Another thing you can hear is that there's a bit of a falling every now and then in some of his speech. So he says, Shayatain defsiku, yeah, and it's got these falling pitches. They're not really distinctive, but they are definitely similar to the Southern speech. So the next variety is Inland Northern Tlingit, and this is spoken in Achlein Kwan, Baselin Kwan, and Tagish Kwan today. It probably used to also be spoken in Taku Kwan on the lower Taku River and on the coast to the south. We don't know for sure, but oral history from Achlein Kwan suggests that this was a continuous sort of a continuous chain. And probably when the Juneau Gold Rush happened, it really shifted populations around a whole bunch and changed the old geographic relationships. So one of the interesting things that I learned when I started working with inlanders is that a whole bunch of their dialect is really similar to mine, all the way down in Wrangell. So we've got these sudden similarities between Teslin and Wrangell, and they're like, I don't know how many miles apart. But it's probably that there used to be a continuum going up the inside coast from Wrangell all the way up to the Taku River, and then up the Taku River and into Atlin and into Teslin. Little hints of that connection are still around in some place names and an oral history of migration and stuff. So the inland northern Tlingit has a bunch of features that are not found in a lot of the other varieties. One that sticks out to a lot of people is the end of at the end of a syllable, some of these sounds are nasal. So you get tie instead of tie for garden. Another one is that certain oo vowels, when they're next to a back consonant, they go from oo to a little lower o. And so you get och instead of och for wolf, och. There's a voiced ul sound in words that are borrowed from neighboring Konana Dene languages. For example, there's daleye for lake trout, which of course we don't have on the coast. And in my variety, I would call it daneye. Auntie Margaret was like, I've heard of that. It's daneye. So I was like, oh, okay, well, should have replaced the ul with the N like we usually do. And then another thing that sticks out to coastal people from other varieties is that the inland varieties often still have m, the m sound that's disappeared in other Tlingit. We know it used to be there. We have, for example, in Russian transcriptions, examples of m written down. And the Russian speakers wouldn't have just put that in arbitrarily if they weren't hearing it. So this sound disappeared in most other dialects, but it's preserved there. So for example, amse'i versus ause'i, she or he cooked it. The documentation of this variety is pretty good, but we still need a lot more study, and a lot of our information is really only from just a couple of people. So here's a quick chunk from Yeshna Tom Peters in Teslin, and this is the story the woman who offended the bear that's in the Dauenhauer 1987 book Hashika. This is a little snippet from it. So you hear particularly in that first sentence, not and there's the M that sticks out very distinctly. So there's another variety of Northern Tlingit that's not talked about much, which is Gulf Coast Northern Tlingit. And this is Quanahu Kwan, Shahayek Kwan, and Gashak Kwan. The only inhabited community on the Gulf Coast today is Yakdat, Yakatan. But even into the early 20th century, there were still people living in Dry Bay and in Kaliak, Kaliak, and even in Katala over near Cordova. So there was sort of a movement of people from these communities, either to places like Huna or to Yakdat in the mid 20th century. And the Qunahu Kwan, notably, a lot of people don't know this anymore, but there used to be villages up the Tachanshini River. It wasn't just at the mouth of the river, but there's one about halfway up, a place called Nuqayik. And Nuqayik was well known that it was a mix of Southern Tachoni people living together with Tlingit people in traditional Tlingit houses where they'd married together. And the Southern Tachoni people in Haines Junction actually still have memory of that place and the interaction with Tlingit. That's one of the reasons they're called Qunahu, Qunanahu among the Athabascans. So Gulf Coast Northern Tlingit is pretty similar to Central Coast, but it is often very conservative, probably because it's quite remote from the rest of the coast. And so there's certain things that changed in other dialects of Tlingit, but took a very long time to change in Gulf Coast Tlingit. And one of them is the la sound, the la, where it's a Y with two dots, used to be distinct and it's gone now. But in older speakers, we hear the word yal for what is now yai, whale, yal instead of yai. And there's a bunch of little subtle differences. So there's a lack of the ejective or pinched sounds sometimes. So for example, jayug instead of chayug for immediately or quickly right now. Certain roundings happens more in this variety. So you get yanuk instead of yanik, he or she is sick. And then sometimes certain vowels get dropped. So sadat I instead of sadat I for a scarf, a neck warmer. There is one unpublished paper about some differences of the Tlingit in Yakutat by Nation Story in 1967. So there's a link here. But other than that, there's really very little that's on the study of this variety. So here's a little sample from Cochain Frank Italio. I can't find a picture of him, but so this is just a picture of old Yakutat in 1952 when this was recorded.
Pikan kanu ko tashkan yiu kot wasya kay khayat khat kusana khtichu khcha an qaw ho استوت kayo ik kayo.
So there's a couple of hints of that Allah sound still in his speech that have become ayah in all modern Tlingit. And there's a few parts where his pronunciation is much more smushed together than you would expect from most Tlingit speakers in the north. So little subtle differences.
The gente kawana an couch kustul yuto sok kit an cow pikan kanu ko tashkan yiu kot wasya kay khayat khat kusana khtichu khcha an qaw ho استوت kayo ik kayo.
So you can hear, particularly, he says achyatku, achyatku instead of achyatku sani. Achyatku sani is one of the parts that pops right out. So last, but of course not least, is the Central Coast. This is what you're familiar with. So Shah Khasani Keek speaks the Huna variation on the same theme. You'll hear from lots of people in Juneau and Sitka and Angoon and Chilkat and so forth. It's the rest in a way. This, of course, there's little minor differences between each community, and the specific features that vary from community to community are not very well studied. And they're also complicated by the fact that people have been moving back and forth between communities a lot. So we have people, like Kekne Nora Dauenhauer. Well, she was born in Huna, but then spent most of her, life in Juneau around Juneau speakers, and then in Huna around Huna speakers, and then in Chakwan and Haines are people up there. So we've got the case where because people have been moving around so much, it's hard to tease apart some of the subtle differences between communities. But there are one thing that we note is this sort of forms a smooth sort of transition from the south to the north. Starting in the transitional varieties, we see an increase in stuff as we go northwards through the central communities, from say Angoon to Sitka to Huna. the varieties of speech get closer and closer towards those that we're going to start to find out on the Gulf Coast in Yakutat. So there is a sense that there's a sort of northern movement to the way that phenomena happen in the language. It's not everywhere, but there's little hints of that here and there. So we see, for example, certain sounds get rounded more often. Plus, for club becomes puts instead. And then we see the E sound become A around these back consonants a lot. So ik becomes ek for copper, for example. This is the best documented of all the Tlingit varieties. It's the typical basis of all the research out there. It's the norm for documentation. It's what people teach in general. So I didn't include any recordings because you've heard a lot of it already. So thanks for listening to me.
Okay.
Yeah, owe kunachwe shikude kunalchi shainki nige that. That was so cool. Thank you for sharing about the ways of speaking Tlingit. This answered a lot of questions for me, and so before we close, I want to make space for students. If you have further questions or comments, go ahead.
Wasit wasa. My grandma was Esther Shea, and her mother married a man from Wrangell, Richard Harris Jr. I don't remember his name, but I was talking to my dad about our language class, and I was explaining to him that we had a guest speaker today I was excited to see. And he told me a short story. He said, because his mom and dad were sent to a boarding school, he didn't learn Tlingit. But when Alice Harris was trying to teach him words, they were difficult for him to learn. She would tap him on the head to try to get him to remember. So my dad says, please tell your instructors thank you for tapping my children on the head. Gonna cheesh.
Oh, I just want to join in and say, thank you for your all of your study was, and it really was very very interesting and captivating to hear that. For me, an in-depth discussion of dialects. So kunas cheese. And I want to say kunas cheese to our teachers for bringing us these esteemed speakers. Kunas cheese.
Okay. Any other comments or questions for Zeosh before we close? Sani.
Goodness, geez, thank you so much. It's very good to hear all this. I had COVID, so my voice is a little bit short. But I want to say that in listening to the songs, my dad, he's Nushkitan, so he would talk and sing a little bit different than my grandmother, who is a cousin to Forrest DeWitt. And so the singing was so different, but it was so beautiful. We harmonized together. That's probably why we got married and stayed together, the two clans. But it's just wonderful to hear. And I just wanted to thank you again for sharing this information, and also for the instructors for bringing Mr. Krypton here. It was just outstanding. Buenos dias. Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? Kunas cheese, Sani. Skinyata.
Yakei Satini Skinya Tla Ye Hatu Asak Yes Nachatati Suknach Adi Ayachet. I heard something as well that was just really profound. I had gotten close to an elder in Club One. She's now gone, but she would talk about her days growing up and moving back and forth and that. her first trip to Juneau, they would rib her about her northern dialect or the sounds she was making. And when she got back from Juneau to Cluckwan, her father was teasing her as well and said, I can't even understand you. And so he said to her that the version that they speak up there is freshwater or clear water language, and that in Juneau it's saltwater or Athene is how, yeah. I got a kick out of hearing it, so it's just great to share. Good enough, Cheese. It was a great presentation today. Appreciate everything that I've heard.
Yeah, awak enough cheese. Anybody else? Okay, Shakhsani Keek, did you have any closing comments for us?
Nachish, haiti de shi, vanach, atitini ato ha inki hanik, ha klein gonachish. I'm again.
Yeah.
Benashisha Sanakik. Benashish tak.
Okay. Well, if we don't have any other comments or questions, I just wanted to reflect. Gunafchish Klein Haiti Dishi Kaha Inki Nige Lingiti Hatangidat Zeosh Kunahawash Dukahatati. Thank you so much for helping us and for sharing with us about language. And we're really grateful for you. So please do come back again.
I will. Ik kwati.
I have a new word for you.
That's why.
When you're muted, people say, you're muted, turn it back on. One of the students came up with outlitik. Outlitik.
Your mouth is plugged up, I think, something like that.
Okay, I love that. Okay, Johan. Well, that closes up our introduction to dialect series. That was an awesome presentation. Hopefully we can get those slides from you, Zosh, and I'll share them on our online learning platform.
Yeah, for sure. I'll upload the PDF, and then I'll take the little sound chunks and put them on a place where you can get to.
Okay, that's awesome. Good night, Johan. We'll see you back here for the students. Same time, same place on Tuesday. Good night.